Let's take a look at the next transparency. This is Brazil's foreign exchange reserves, which up in the middle of the year in 1998 had been up as high as about $75 billion. That's the very peak up there. Over the next month, it dropped a little bit. But then, when Russia blew out in August, the Brazilian reserves plummeted as people and speculators, hedge funds, began to pull their funds out of Brazil in a massive fashion, pull their money out of the entire so-called emerging markets, and Brazilian reserves began to plummet dramatically. There was a brief period where the IMF package was put together, a hyperinflationary $41 billion bailout, which didn't steady things for very long, and the reserves continued to plummet. Now, that little red triangle at the end is money which the IMF has just pumped into Brazil, $9 billion. Without that money, Brazil's reserves would now be under $25 billion, one-third the level they were at just about 6 months ago. With that money, they've just barely managed to hold things steady. In other words, bankers and hedge funds are pulling their money out, and the IMF is throwing money in to make sure that the bankers and the hedge funds can get out safely. And Brazil, to hell with Brazil, it's falling apart. So with its reserves plummeting in this fashion, Brazil finally, on January 13th, devalued by approximately 8%, and then a massive run against the currency developed. And the entire world financial system, like in the case of LTCM, was hanging by a thread at that point. There was an emergency meeting at the Federal Reserve, once again, as there was in the LTCM case. George Soros was there to help encourage people as the direction to be gone, which is to help bail out his hedge funds. There was significant discussion there and in the subsequent Davos meeting of forcing Brazil to establish a currency board, which is to say, don't you worry about a thing, honey. We'll take care of the money for you. That's what a currency board is, British colonial system. Now, don't you worry your little pretty head about this one little bit. We'll take care of everything. All right? And the way this works is that the bankers first obliterate your country, they create complete instability, and then they come in and they offer a currency board as the only way that you can possibly get stability. You just have to hand over control of your country, a minor cost, to the foreign bankers who will run the currency board. This is your typical mafia tactic. Late at night, they throw a chair through the window, your storefront, and then the next morning they come in and they offer you protection. We got a currency board for you. Wouldn't you like it? With a big smile on their face. And this is what they did in Indonesia, this is what they did in Russia, and this is what they're now trying to do in Brazil. So watch this currency board business. Now, what has happened in Brazil over the course of January? And I want to look at this almost in slow motion, because this really tells you what bankers' arithmetic is all about. This is like a slow motion picture of bankers' arithmetic. Now, watch closely, keep your hand on your wallet, and this is how it works. Next slide. Okay. Now, we've frequently talked about bankers' arithmetic. Many of you have seen this in our publications. This is the case of Brazil. This is Brazil's situation from 1980 to 1998. Now, the red curve is the total official foreign debt of Brazil. In 1980, it was $72 billion. Over the course of the next 19 years, from 1980 to 1998, Brazil paid $146 billion in interest payments alone. In other words, almost twice the original principal. And yet at the end of that period, after paying in interest alone almost twice what they owed $231 billion, 3 times as much as the original debt. So, in bankers' arithmetic, 72 minus 146 is equal to 231. You won't be clapping after you see how it's done. Don't worry, I'm going to ask you to count in a minute. So, all right. So that's bankers' arithmetic. That's how it works. Now, people have noted, and it's a valid point. Well, wait a minute. You're not taking into account both any new money that may have come into the country productively to Brazil, and you're also not including amortization payments, principal payments out. And it's true. This graphic, this representation abstracts from that. But when you take those two flows into account, any new real money going in and any principal repayment coming out, guess what? It's worse. For example, I did a preliminary calculation in the next transparency. You can see what would have happened to Brazil's official foreign debt if it were deflated in this fashion. And Lin has some specifications of how to do this in his paper. And this is a preliminary calculation of what the deflated, not the fully legitimate debt, you'd have to deflate that even further. But this gives you a rough idea of what that would be. And it wouldn't have grown to 231 billion, it would have only grown to 114 billion. Okay, now what happened? Next transparency. Well, first of all, the official foreign debt is not really the full total foreign debt of Brazil. Because in addition to the official foreign debt, you have to consider bonds that they have issued which are denominated in dollars, which are effective foreign obligations. You have to count investment by foreigners in the stock market and other forms of foreign obligations. So we've calculated that Brazil's real foreign debt, based on this calculation, at the end of 1998 was $481 billion. Well, what happened in January 1999? The value of the real, the Brazilian currency, plummeted from 1.22 reals to the dollar to 1.94 reals to the dollar, about a 40% devaluation in a month. Now, please take a seat as a Brazilian for a moment, not as an American. If you're a Brazilian looking at your foreign debt of $481 billion, back on January 1st of this year, that $481 billion was equal to about 500 billion reales, more or less. Right there. 1 month later, after the devaluation, that same $481 billion in obligation is going to cost you 933 billion reales. Banker's arithmetic. And that's what you've got to pay. They lend you in dollars, you want to go back and pay at the original exchange rate, they say, oh no, I'm sorry. Don't you know? The real has been devalued. What do you mean the real has been devalued? How could that be? The real can't be devalued just like that. You say, of course, don't you understand? Markets rule the world. You obviously have not studied economics at Harvard. And there you are, not having studied at Harvard, and your debt has just doubled. Now, this is one of the ways in which banker's arithmetic works. Let me just make this point clear. The way banker's arithmetic works, the reason that this thing doesn't add up, that you get this crazy arithmetic, is because they cheat. How do they cheat? They change the unit of account on you. They lend you 100, and then they say, oh no, I'm sorry. That 100 is now not worth 100. That's worth 200. You got to pay me 200. Why? We run the markets. Tough luck. What's the matter? Didn't you study at Harvard? So it's cheating based on the question of the unit of account, how you measure. And this is one of the effects on banker's arithmetic. It's the devaluation effect. Let's look at another effect in the next transparency. This is the effect of interest rates. Thank you also, IMF. Brazil didn't fully follow IMF directions in January. Brazil's interest rate internally was 25%. They only raised their interest rates to 40% on IMF instructions. The IMF wanted them to raise interest rates to 70%. But so far they haven't done that. But by raising interest rates domestically from 25 to 40%, the treasury bonds which they had issued prior to that changed in terms of what they were costing the government. How? Because the government had done two very clever things. First, they issued some bonds denominated in dollars. Why did they issue bonds denominated in dollars? Because they were trying to convince the market that they would never, ever, ever devalue. Dramatically raise interest rates. But then they were forced to dramatically raise interest rates. And the effect of this on their bonded debt over the period of the first 6 months of this year is going to raise that bonded debt from about 320 billion reales, where it is today, up to close to 500 billion reales in 6 months' time. Over the period of December 95 to December 97, Treasury bonds, the bonded debt of Brazil, was growing merely at 40% a year. Over the next year, it was growing only at 50% a year. Now, it's going to grow at 120% per year. Banker's arithmetic. So there you have the devaluation effect. There you have the interest rate effect. And the third effect that I want to talk about is the effect of changing terms of trade. See, this is the other way the bankers cheat. They change what they pay you if you're a third world country exporting. They lower those prices, and they raise the prices of the exports that they ship to you. So that the price of what you are exporting with which you pay your debt drops. They're changing the unit of measurement. And you complain and you say, hey, wait a minute, that's not fair. And they say, well, we didn't say it was fair. That's the market. What's the matter? Didn't you study at Harvard? And look at what happened to the price of oil over the last 9-10 months. It fell by half. What if you're Mexico? What if you're Nigeria? What if you're Venezuela? It dropped from $22 per barrel down to $11 per barrel. What if you're Mexico and 40% of your government budget revenue comes from oil? Well, you just had 20% of your budget wiped out. Right? If 40% of your budget is oil and the price falls in half, you just lost half of your budget. And look at the case of Mexico with the public debt of Mexico and what happened just as a result of the oil price. That's the red part there. Oh, the debt was already rising, but the oil price effect automatically raises it that much further. And if you're a Mexican and you know what this is going to do to your country because you have no budget for infrastructure, no budget for health, no budget for food subsidies, no budget for nothing except paying the debt, you say, hey, that's not fair. And George Soros says, you obviously didn't study at Harvard. But don't worry, we'll appoint a good advisor to you who did. We'll send you Arminio Fraga. So these are three ways in which bankers' arithmetic actually works. It's cheating. It's cheating because they control the game. They control the metric. They say, this is the unit of account. This is how we're going to count everything. And if you stick to that, if you say, yes, prices, money, debt, this is all sacrosanct, and the world be damned, then the world will be damned, and we will have a new dark age. There is no way this can coexist with human beings. It can't happen anymore. The water is turning to ice.